Let me tell you about the Galactic Military Academy's crown jewel of educational sadism, the Tactical Assessment Simulation, or as everyone called it, the Impossible Test. This little gem had a success rate that would make a lottery ticket look like a sure bet. We're talking 0.3%, folks, not 3%. 0.3. As in, virtually nobody passes this thing. The Academy loved to brag about this statistic. They'd carved it into marble above the testing center entrance right next to their motto, "Excellence through impossibility." Real inspiring stuff. Makes you want to sign up immediately, doesn't it? The test itself was supposedly designed by the galaxy's greatest military minds, which should have been the first red flag. When you get a bunch of generals together to design something, you don't get efficiency. You get a bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in 17 layers of unnecessary complexity and tied up with a bow made of pure ego. Picture this: a sterile white room filled with the kind of advanced technology that cost more than most planets' GDP, holographic displays, quantum processors, and in the center of it all, the scanner. This wasn't just any scanner, mind you. This was a tactical brilliance assessment device, a machine so sophisticated it could allegedly measure the strategic potential of any sentient being down to the molecular level. The scanner looked like what would happen if a crystal ball had an unholy union with a supercomputer. It pulsed with an eerie blue light and made soft humming sounds that somehow managed to be both soothing and ominous. The Academy text treated it like a religious artifact, which wasn't far from the truth considering how much faith they put in its readings. On this particular day, 4 cadets sat in the waiting area, each one a spectacular example of their species' finest military potential. Well, that's what their file said anyway. Reality, as usual, was having a good laugh at paperwork. And then there was Jake Morrison. Jake was sitting in the corner looking about as concerned as someone waiting for a bus. He wore the standard Academy uniform like it was a comfortable pair of jeans, which probably violated at least 6 regulations. His hair was slightly messy. He had a small coffee stain on his sleeve, and he was reading what appeared to be an actual paper book. Not a holographic display, not a neural interface download, but an honest-to-goodness physical book made of dead trees. The other cadets kept stealing glances at him, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. A few were whispering among themselves in their native languages, probably trying to figure out what species he was. The answer, which would have horrified them even more, was embarrassingly simple: human. Jake Morrison was the first member of humanity ever admitted to the Galactic Military Academy. This wasn't because humans were considered unworthy of admission. It was because, until recently, nobody in the galaxy knew humans existed. Earth had been catalogued as a primitive backwater world with amusing radio signals and promptly forgotten about. Then some bureaucrat noticed that those amusing radio signals had evolved into something resembling actual civilization, complete with space travel and everything. After considerable debate, several committees, and what historians would later describe as the most reluctant first contact in galactic history, humanity was grudgingly admitted to the galactic community. Jake's admission to the Academy was less a matter of qualification and more a matter of, well, we suppose someone has to represent them. He'd been selected through a process that Earth's military called comprehensive evaluation, and everyone else called drawing straws. First up was Zephyr, and if you've never met a crystalline being with a superiority complex, consider yourself lucky. Zephyr looked like someone had taken a chandelier, given it consciousness, and then sent it to military school. They communicated through harmonic frequencies that sounded like a wind chime having an anxiety attack. And their species believed that mathematics was the universal language of warfare. Zephyr had spent the last 3 years at the Academy calculating the precise angle of every laser blast, the optimal trajectory for every movement, and the exact probability of success for every tactical decision. Their homework looked like the kind of equations that made theoretical physicists cry. Unfortunately, all that mathematical perfection had resulted in a combat record that could generously be described as consistently theoretical. Next was Gorvak, who represented everything you'd expect from a member of the legendary Kral warrior race, except for the part where he was actually good at warfare. Gorvak stood 8 feet tall, had muscles that had muscles, and came from a species that considered death before dishonor to be a casual greeting. His people had been conquering star systems since before most species had invented the wheel. The problem was that Gorvak had what his species delicately referred to as pre-battle digestive irregularities, and what everyone else called performance anxiety so severe it required medical intervention. He'd inherited all the physical prowess of his warrior ancestors and none of their casual relationship with violence. Put him in a combat simulation and he'd spend the first 10 minutes looking for the nearest bathroom. Then there was Pip, who proved that good things don't always come in small packages. Pip stood roughly 3 feet tall, had skin that looked like polished copper, and possessed an intellect that could have powered a small space station. Their species had invented interstellar travel while most of the galaxy was still figuring out fire, and they never let anyone forget it. Pip's problem wasn't intelligence. It was the fact that they treated every military exercise like a personal insult to their engineering capabilities. Present them with a standard tactical problem, and they'd redesign the entire scenario to be more efficient. Their solutions were always brilliant, innovative, and completely impossible to implement with existing technology. Pip didn't think outside the box. They redesigned the box, patented the improvements, and then sued the original box for copyright infringement. Supervising this collection of promising disappointments was Commander Vex, a being whose species was renowned for their tactical genius and whose personal career was renowned for its tragic lack of said genius. Vex looked like what would happen if you crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet, and had the personality to match. Commander Vex had been teaching at the Academy for 15 years, during which time exactly 0 of their students had passed the impossible test. This wasn't entirely their fault, but try explaining that to the Academy Review Board. Vex had long since abandoned any hope of career advancement and now approached their job with the enthusiasm of someone waiting for retirement to put them out of everyone's misery. And there sat Jake, completely oblivious to the cosmic irony unfolding around him. He'd finished his book, somehow produced a sandwich from nowhere, and was eating lunch while reviewing what appeared to be handwritten notes on actual paper. The other cadets were staring at him like he was some sort of fascinating alien artifact, which, from their perspective, he was. The waiting area's silence was broken only by the soft humming of the scanner in the next room and the occasional digestive sound from Gorvak's general direction. It was the kind of tense quiet that usually preceded either a great victory or a spectacular disaster. Today, it was going to be both. Commander Vex emerged from the testing chamber with the expression of someone who'd just remembered they had to work for a living. Their compound eyes swept over the assembled cadets with all the enthusiasm of a tax auditor reviewing funeral expenses. "The tactical assessment simulation will now commence," Vex announced in a voice that could have made a funeral seem cheerful. "As you are all aware, this test has maintained a failure rate of 99.7% for the past century. This is not a bug. This is a feature." The testing scenario was, in typical Academy fashion, designed to be as impossible as it was elaborate. The simulation presented a rescue mission on the planet Zerion Prime, where a diplomatic convoy had been captured by hostile forces. The planet featured unstable weather patterns, hostile wildlife, complex political dynamics, and terrain that could charitably be described as aggressively inconvenient. The cadets had access to limited resources, insufficient intel, and equipment that was guaranteed to malfunction at the worst possible moment. Standard military doctrine said the mission was impossible. The Academy's computers had run the scenario 8 million times and achieved success exactly 0 times. It was, in short, the perfect test for an institution that prided itself on impossibility. Zephyr went first, naturally. They approached the simulation with the confidence of someone who had spent years reducing warfare to mathematical certainties. The crystalline being's strategy involved calculating the precise probability matrices for every possible outcome, cross-referencing them with 17 different tactical databases, and then selecting the approach with the highest theoretical success rate. For 23 minutes, Zephyr's harmonic frequencies filled the chamber as they computed variables, analyzed data streams, and generated tactical projections that looked like abstract art. Their solution was mathematically perfect, logically sound, and completely divorced from anything resembling practical reality. The simulation lasted exactly 4 minutes before Zephyr's forces were completely annihilated by a weather pattern they'd calculated as having only a 0.3% chance of occurring. The scanner registered their tactical brilliance as error, insufficient data. Gorvak was next, and he approached the simulation with the kind of determined confidence that his warrior ancestors would have been proud of, right up until the moment he started hyperventilating. His strategy was refreshingly straightforward. Assemble a strike force, charge directly at the enemy, and resolve the situation through superior firepower and intimidation. It was a perfectly valid approach from a species that had conquered half the galaxy through sheer bloody-mindedness. Unfortunately, Gorvak spent so much time psyching himself up for the assault that he forgot to account for the hostile wildlife, the unstable terrain, or the fact that his strike force needed actual orders beyond charge and try not to die. His simulation ended when his entire army fell into a sinkhole while he was still giving himself a pep talk. The scanner rated his tactical brilliance as does not compute. Pip's attempt was a masterpiece of over-engineering. They took one look at the scenario and immediately began redesigning everything from the rescue equipment to the fundamental laws of physics governing the planet's ecosystem. Their plan involved 17 different technological innovations, a complete restructuring of the diplomatic mission's original objectives, and what appeared to be the invention of 3 new branches of science. The plan was absolutely brilliant. It was also completely impossible to implement with anything short of a galactic-level industrial infrastructure and about 50 years of research and development. Pip's forces spent the entire simulation waiting for equipment that wouldn't be invented for another century, while the hostages presumably died of old age. The scanner's assessment of Pip's tactical brilliance was a series of error messages in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Jake watched all of this unfold with the kind of detached interest usually reserved for particularly entertaining traffic accidents. He'd taken notes during each attempt, though what he was writing down was anyone's guess. When Commander Vex called his name, he stood up, brushed the sandwich crumbs off his uniform, and walked into the testing chamber like he was heading to a coffee shop. The other cadets exchanged glances that ranged from pity to morbid curiosity. They'd all failed in their own spectacular ways, but at least they'd failed with style, complexity, and mathematical precision. Jake was about to fail with whatever the human equivalent of tactical thinking was, which nobody was entirely sure existed. Commander Vex activated the simulation with the weary resignation of someone who'd watched this same tragedy play out hundreds of times before. The scanner hummed to life, its blue glow reflecting off Jake's remarkably unconcerned face. The impossible test was about to meet something it had never encountered before, a human who hadn't read the manual. Jake looked at the tactical display with the same expression most people reserve for figuring out what to have for lunch. The holographic representation of Zerion Prime rotated slowly in front of him, complete with topographical data, weather patterns, enemy positions, and about 17 different ways everything could go catastrophically wrong. He scratched his chin, which somehow managed to sound loud in the suddenly quiet chamber. The other cadets were pressed against the observation window like spectators at the galaxy's most awkward sporting event. "So," Jake said, his voice cutting through the chamber's dramatic tension like a butter knife through the Academy's pretensions, "we need to rescue some diplomats from a hostile planet with unstable weather and dangerous wildlife." Commander Vex nodded slowly, waiting for the inevitable request for additional data, tactical analysis, or probability matrices. Every cadet always wanted more information, better equipment, or different parameters. It was a universal constant. Instead, Jake asked, "Do we know what time of day it is on the planet?" The question was so mundane that Commander Vex actually had to process it for a moment. "Local time is approximately 1400 hours, they replied, consulting their datapad with the confusion of someone who'd never been asked about lunch scheduling during a military simulation. "Good," Jake nodded. "And the hostile forces? Are they local militia or professional military?" "Intelligence suggests a mixture of local insurgents and off-world mercenaries," Commander Vex replied, still waiting for the real questions to begin. "Right. And the diplomats, how long have they been held?" "Approximately 18 hours. Jake nodded again, as if this was all perfectly reasonable information that any sensible person would want to know. He studied the tactical display for another moment, then looked up with the kind of smile that made seasoned military instructors nervous. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," he announced. "We're going to walk up to the front door and ask for our people back." The silence that followed this statement was the kind usually reserved for moments of profound cosmic significance or spectacular mental breakdowns. Commander Vex's compound eyes actually rotated independently as their brain tried to process what they'd just heard. "I beg your pardon?" Vex managed. "We're going to knock on their door and negotiate," Jake repeated, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Look, these people grabbed some diplomats, right? That means they want something. They're not holding them for fun. They're holding them because they've got demands that nobody's listening to." He gestured at the tactical display with the casual confidence of someone explaining why the sky was blue. "So instead of charging in with guns blazing or calculating the precise trajectory of every laser bolt, we find out what they want and see if we can work something out." The observation window was now completely fogged up from the breathing of 4 cadets whose worldviews were simultaneously collapsing and reforming. Zephyr's harmonic frequencies had shifted into what could only be described as confused static. "But the simulation parameters clearly indicate hostile intent," Commander Vex protested, their training manual probably spontaneously combusting somewhere in their mind. "Sure, they're hostile," Jake agreed cheerfully, "but they're not stupid. They grab diplomats instead of, say, random tourists or cargo shipments. They want to negotiate, they just want to negotiate from a position of strength. So we give them that respect and see what happens." He paused, considering the tactical display again. "Of course, we'll keep our weapons ready and have backup plans because sometimes negotiation doesn't work. But you'd be amazed how many problems you can solve just by talking to people like they're people instead of tactical obstacles to overcome." Commander Vex stared at Jake with the expression of someone who had just watched the fundamental laws of physics politely excuse themselves from the universe. In their 15 years of teaching, no cadet had ever suggested that the solution to a military crisis might involve basic communication skills. "You want to talk to them," Vex repeated slowly. "Revolutionary concept, I know," Jake replied with a grin that somehow managed to be both friendly and deeply unsettling to everyone watching. The scanner, meanwhile, was making sounds that nobody had heard before. Instead of its usual confident humming, it was producing a series of confused beeps and whirs, like a computer trying to calculate the square root of purple. Its blue glow had started flickering uncertainly. Jake noticed the scanner's distress and gave it a reassuring pat, which somehow made the situation even worse. "Don't worry," he told the machine cheerfully. "This'll all make sense in a minute." The scanner's response was a sound that could best be described as electronic weeping. Part 5. When technology meets humanity's stubborn refusal to complicate things. What happened next would be discussed in Academy tactical theory classes for the next century, assuming anyone could figure out how to explain it without causing mass existential crises among the faculty. Jake initiated his strategy with the kind of casual competence that made professional soldiers nervous. He contacted the hostile forces using standard diplomatic channels, identified himself as a representative of the galactic community, and politely inquired about the possibility of opening negotiations for the release of the diplomatic personnel. The response was immediate and, frankly, refreshingly honest. The local insurgent leader, a being named Crix, who sounded like they'd been waiting for someone to ask, explained that they were holding the diplomats because their planet's legitimate government had been systematically ignored by the galactic community for the past decade. Their planet was dying. Their star was entering an unstable phase. Their ecosystem was collapsing, and their requests for aid and relocation assistance had been buried under galactic bureaucracy for so long that some of the original petitions had literally fossilized in filing cabinets. "We've been trying to get attention through proper channels for 10 years, Crix explained over the communication link. "We've filed requests, submitted applications, followed protocols, and gotten nothing but form letters saying our case is under review. So we grabbed some diplomats. Suddenly everyone wants to talk." Jake nodded sympathetically. "That must be incredibly frustrating. Nobody likes being ignored, especially when their entire planet is at stake." Commander Vex was frantically checking their tactical manuals for the appropriate response to enemy forces who were being reasonable and articulate about their grievances. The manuals, it turned out, had not anticipated this scenario. "Look," Jake continued, "I can't promise to solve your planet's problems right now. But I can promise that if you release the diplomats unharmed, I'll make sure your situation gets the attention it deserves. Real attention, not bureaucratic runaround." There was a pause on the other end of the communication link. "And why should we trust you?" "Because I'm not a diplomat," Jake replied with perfect honesty. "I'm just a guy who thinks that when someone's planet is dying, maybe we should help them instead of making them fill out forms in triplicate." The scanner, meanwhile, had progressed from confused beeping to what could only be described as mechanical hyperventilation. Its readings were fluctuating wildly between impossible and error, please consult manual, with occasional bursts of what is happening. 30 minutes later, the diplomatic hostages were released unharmed. Crix's government had a scheduled meeting with the Galactic Aid Committee, and Jake had somehow negotiated a peaceful resolution to what the Academy's computers had deemed an impossible military scenario. The scanner's response to this development was to emit a sound like a coffee machine having a nervous breakdown, followed by a shower of sparks that set off the chamber's fire suppression system. Through the resulting chaos of alarms, sprinklers, and emergency lighting, Jake could be heard asking Commander Vex if anyone had thought to bring towels. The other cadets were pressed against the observation window in a state of shock that transcended normal psychological categories. Zephyr's harmonic frequencies had shifted into what sounded like mechanical sobbing. Gorvak was hyperventilating, but for once, it wasn't from performance anxiety. Pip was frantically taking notes on what appeared to be a complete redesign of their understanding of tactical theory. Commander Vex stood in the middle of the flooding chamber, their compound eyes wide with the kind of existential horror usually reserved for people who'd just realized they'd been doing their jobs completely wrong for their entire careers. And Jake Morrison, the first human ever to take the Academy's impossible test, was calmly wringing out his uniform and wondering if anyone knew where he could get a decent cup of coffee. The scanner gave one final, pathetic electronic whimper and then shut down completely, apparently having reached the conclusion that reality was too complicated to measure accurately. The aftermath of Jake's test created what historians would later describe as the most politely catastrophic administrative crisis in galactic military history. Within hours, the Academy's emergency response team, senior faculty, and 3 separate committees had descended upon the testing center like bureaucratic locusts. The scanner, once the pride of galactic tactical assessment technology, now resembled what you'd get if a sophisticated piece of military hardware had tried to understand modern art and given up halfway through. It sat in the corner of the flooded chamber, occasionally emitting small puffs of smoke and electronic whimpering sounds. Head of Tactical Assessment, Admiral Trent arrived with the kind of barely controlled panic usually reserved for people who'd discovered that their entire career was based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Trent was a distinguished member of the Valorian species, known throughout the galaxy for their strategic brilliance and their inability to comprehend why anyone would choose simple solutions over complicated ones. Commander Vex. Admiral Trent began, their voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone trying very hard not to scream. "I need you to explain to me how a primitive human solved a scenario that has defeated the galaxy's finest military minds for over a century." Commander Vex, who was still dripping wet from the fire suppression system and experiencing what could charitably be called a complete professional identity crisis, gestured helplessly at Jake. "He talked to them, sir." "He what?" "He talked to them. He asked them what they wanted, listened to their concerns, and then offered to help them address their legitimate grievances through proper channels." Admiral Trent stared at Jake with the expression of someone who'd just been told that the solution to interstellar warfare was a strongly worded letter and a nice cup of tea. "That's not tactics, that's diplomacy," Jake suggested helpfully. The word hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Diplomacy wasn't supposed to work on impossible military scenarios. Diplomacy was what you did after the military had exhausted all the interesting tactical options. It certainly wasn't supposed to be the first choice of someone taking a tactical assessment. But the test parameters specifically indicate hostile forces with no interest in negotiation, Admiral Trent protested. Did they, though? Jake asked, pulling out his handwritten notes. Because when I looked at the scenario, I saw desperate people who'd been ignored by the galactic community for a decade and had resorted to hostage-taking to get attention. That's not military action, that's a cry for help with really bad timing. He flipped through his notes, which appeared to be written in actual ink on actual paper, a sight that made several Academy officials visibly uncomfortable. The key was recognizing that they didn't want to hurt anyone. They wanted to be heard. So I listened. The silence that followed this explanation was the kind that usually preceded either revolutionary breakthroughs or complete systemic collapse. In this case, it was going to be both. Pip, who had been frantically recalculating everything they thought they knew about tactical theory, suddenly spoke up. The human approach bypassed the entire tactical framework by redefining the problem parameters. Exactly, Zephyr harmonized, their frequencies still shaky from recent trauma. Instead of treating it as a military engagement, the human treated it as a communication failure. Gorvak, who was having his first anxiety-free moment in years, nodded enthusiastically. He didn't overthink it. He just did what made sense. Commander Vex looked at their former students with growing horror. You're all talking like this approach actually worked. It did work, Admiral Trent said quietly, staring at the smoking remains of the scanner. That's the problem. The full implications of Jake's success were beginning to dawn on everyone present. If a human with no formal military training could solve the Academy's ultimate challenge using basic communication skills and common sense, what did that say about the galaxy's approach to military education? More importantly, what did it say about the scanner, the Academy's most prized possession, which had just suffered a complete mechanical breakdown when confronted with practical problem-solving? Jake, meanwhile, had found a dry spot to sit and was reviewing his notes with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed a moderately interesting assignment. He looked up to find everyone staring at him. Is there a problem? He asked. Mr. Morrison, Admiral Trent said carefully, your approach to the simulation was highly irregular. Was it wrong, though? The question hung in the air like an accusation. It wasn't wrong. It had worked. It had worked so well that it had broken the Academy's most sophisticated testing equipment and called into question a century of military educational theory. No, Admiral Trent admitted. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't what we were looking for. What were you looking for? Another pause. The honest answer, which nobody wanted to say out loud, was that they'd been looking for brilliant failures. The Academy's reputation was built on the impossibility of the test, not on anyone actually passing it. Jake's success threatened to expose the entire system as an elaborate exercise in academic masturbation. We were looking for tactical innovation within established military frameworks, Admiral Trent said finally. Jake nodded thoughtfully. So you wanted creative thinking, but only the right kind of creative thinking? Essentially, yes. And my kind of creative thinking, the kind that actually solved the problem, that's the wrong kind. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. Finally, Admiral Trent spoke with the tone of someone making a decision they knew they'd regret. Mr. Morrison, congratulations. You have achieved the distinction of being the first cadet to pass the tactical assessment simulation. You have also achieved the distinction of being the last cadet to take it. The test is hereby suspended pending a complete review of its effectiveness. Jake grinned. Does that mean I graduate? No, Admiral Trent replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd found a loophole. It means Earth's admission to the Galactic Military Academy is suspended pending a review of human tactical methodology and its compatibility with galactic military doctrine. So I'm expelled for being too good at this? You're expelled for making the rest of us look bad. Jake stood up, brushed off his damp uniform, and headed for the door. As he passed the broken scanner, he gave it another reassuring pat. The machine responded with what sounded like electronic gratitude. Thanks for the experience, Jake called over his shoulder. I'll be sure to tell everyone back on Earth that the galaxy's premier military academy is afraid of humans who ask questions and talk to people. As the door closed behind him, Admiral Trent turned to Commander Vex. Make sure that human gets off this station as quickly as possible. And then and then we pretend this never happened. 6 months later, Earth received an official communication from the Galactic Military Academy informing them that due to pedagogical incompatibilities, human enrollment in Academy programs would be suspended indefinitely. The message was filed away by Earth's military bureaucracy, with a note that the Academy was probably afraid of fair competition. Jake Morrison returned to Earth with a story that nobody quite believed, and a recommendation that humanity might want to consider starting its own military academy. One that focused on practical problem-solving instead of elaborate failure. The Academy's impossible test was quietly retired and replaced with a new assessment that specifically excluded primitive diplomatic solutions and excessive application of common sense. And somewhere in a storage facility on the Academy station, a broken scanner sits in a box marked "Equipment Failure, Unknown Cause," occasionally emitting soft electronic sounds that almost sound like laughter.